Hello and welcome everyone to a new Construct 3 tutorial. In this video I will be walking you through how to make on-screen markers that tell the player where loot or other items are located outside the viewport area. I have this project set up to create loot randomly, and then a triangular marker is also created and assigned to that item at the edge of the screen to notify the player that there is something of interest out of their current field of view. These markers stay at the edge of the screen and always point in the direction of the item that they are assigned to. And once the item comes on screen, the marker disappears. And when the item goes back off screen, the marker reappears. Once the item is collected, both the item and the marker are destroyed together. But we can have as many items in the level as we want, and there will always be a dedicated marker pointing towards it. So let's get started. Thank you for stopping by today. If you are not subscribed to this channel, make sure you hit that sub button and click on that thumbs up for me as well. I always appreciate your support. Alright, I am going to start a new project and give it a name. I'll call mine Loot Markers. That's going to be a 1920 by 1080 landscape, and I'm going to check Optimize for Pixel Art for mine, and I'll go ahead and create the project. And here in our layout, I'm going to zoom out. And let's change the size of our playing area. So click on the layout. It'll bring up the layout properties. And in size, I'm going to go for 5,000 and 5,000. So that gives us a much larger area to test out our mechanic. And then over here in our layers panel, we have the one layer to start out with. I'm going to click on that layer and come over here to the properties and check transparent. And then I'm going to rename the layer marker or markers. And then back over here in the layer panel, let's right click and add a layer to the bottom. I'm going to call this one background. And make sure the background layer is selected, and let's double click, and I'm going to type in tile background, and I'll insert that somewhere towards the top left. I'm going to turn my grid on. And if we go into configure grid, I have a grid width of 125 by 125 with snap turned on to edges. And in the size of the actual tiled background is 250 by 250. So our grid lines are exactly half of our 250. So I'm going to come over here and get a very dark gray, almost black color. Then I'm going to get a square tool. And because we have snap turned on for our grid, you can see the starting point for our square tool just snaps to the edges of the grid. So in the top left corner, I'm going to click and drag down, release to make a square. And then I'll grab the fill tool and just fill it. And then get my square tool again, and I'm going to put it in the center, make it snap to the center of the grid, click and drag down until we get another square. And then we can fill that one too. Then I'm going to get a slightly less dark gray color, something like that. And with the fill tool, just fill in those two squares. Okay, I'll turn the grid off. There we go. I'm going to exit out of that and rename it background. And then if we click on the layout just anywhere, we can come over to the properties, and I'm going to choose snap to grid. And we got quite a bit of space going on here, so I'm going to change this to 128, 128. And that way we can see that it's snapping. So I'm going to get it right in the corner up there, and then drag it all the way down to the bottom right corner so that it covers our whole playing area. And we can actually play that, and there we go. We got a big old checkerboard. But we're only seeing the top left part of our layout. That's this dotted line that you can kind of barely see right there. We do not need that anymore. I'm going to lock the background layer and select the markers layer. And let's create another object. I'm going to double click and scroll down to sprite. And let's insert that. And let's go change the size to 96 by 96. And I'm going to get a nice bright green color just so we can tell the difference between what objects are what. And I'm going to zoom in here Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the grid, and Let's configure grid, and half of 96 is 48. And I'm going to turn snapping off. And then I'll turn the grid on. So now we have some guidelines to go by. And I'm going to start in the very top right corner. And I'm going to just draw a diagonal line to the right side middle where our grid intersects on the right side. And then I'll click and drag another line down here, get our fill tool, and fill that in. Very simple. We just need something to reference. And then let's get the origin point. And this is going to be our player object. So I don't want the origin point right in the middle because when it rotates, it's going to look kind of funny. So we want to come back a little ways, like somewhere right about there. And actually, I'm going to go with 34 for the X and 48 for the Y. And let's make sure that our bounding box is covering our player. I'll go ahead and just move this to the middle right there, and then we can right click on this one and delete it. All right, I'm going to exit out of that and rename it player. And while we are still in the player's properties, let's scroll down to behaviors and let's add a new one. And I'm going to type in the number 8, and that'll give us 8 direction. And then I'm going to set up a few values over here. I'm going to do a max speed of 600, acceleration and deceleration both at 2000. And I want 8 directions and set angle smooth. If we just move this into our viewport area up here in the top left and push play, we can use the arrow keys to move our player around. But we have quite a bit of work left to do, so I'm going to exit out of that. Zoom back out. I'm going to move this back towards the center. And I personally don't like using the arrow keys to control the player, so I'm going to uncheck default controls, and we're going to set up our own controls. And to do that, we're going to need to use the keyboard object so we can access some keys. So let's go over to the project panel, right-click on object types, add new object type, and I'm going to type in keyboard, and there it is. We've added it to the project. And then let's go over to the event sheet, and I am going to add an event and go get our keyboard, and I want key is down, and I'm going to click to choose. Let's start with the A key. I'm going to do WASD for controls. Hit done, and I'm going to stretch this out a little. And I'm also going to increase the font size. You can do that by holding Control and pressing the plus key. And that makes it bigger. And you can shrink it by holding Control and pushing the minus key. All right, let's add an action to this. Go into our player, and let's get simulate control. And A is going to be left. And then I will click to highlight this entire block of code, Control C to copy, Control V to paste, and then I'm going to paste 4 total. And then I'll go into the second one, just double click to go into it, click on it. I'm going to change this to a D, change this one to a W, and this one will be S. So A, D, W, S. A is left, D, we can double click to go into that, change left to right. Our W is going to be up, and S will be down. Okay, that sets up some controls. Let's right click in this blank area down here, go to add group, and I'm going to call this player controls. And I'm going to highlight all 4 of those, click and drag them into that group, and close the group up. Okay, back on the layout, let's make sure our player is selected. And over in the properties, let's add another behavior. And this one's going to be the scroll to behavior. You can just type that in, scroll to. And now, if we play, there is our character, and the camera follows us no matter where we go. All right, I'll exit out of that. Seems a bit slow to me. I'm going to move mine up to, let's say, 700. I feel like that is a little smoother speed-wise. Okay, at this point, if you have not saved your project yet, let's go ahead and do that. When you click save, if you have not saved it yet, you will have to give it a file name and make sure it is saved in a folder somewhere on your device where you know where it is. So go ahead and save, and I'll do the same. Okay, back on the layout, let's double click and scroll down to sprite and insert another sprite. And let's change the size to 64 by 64. And I'm going to turn the grid off. And I'm going to get the circle or ellipse tool. And I'm going to go with some kind of bluish color. And let's do a border thickness of 1. And I'm going to zoom in a little. And from the top left, click and drag. I'm going to hold shift to constrain the circle width and height. And just make sure that we fill up the whole box. All right, and we can get our fill tool, fill that in, and let's get the origin point, and I'm going to hit 5 on the numpad on my keyboard. If you don't have a numpad, you can go over to origin, right-click, quick assign, and I went with middle. Okay, let's exit out of that, rename it loot, and then let's go ahead and create our markers. So let's double-click again, scroll down, get another sprite, insert, and let's resize this to 24 by 24. And then I'm going to zoom in, and let's get the line tool, and I'm going to get a solid black, border thickness of 1, and let's go into our configure grid. I'm going to go 12 by 12, and I'll turn it on, and then I'm just going to draw a line there and a line here, and then another one to close it off. Then I'll get a nice red color and fill it. And I'm going to use a white color to make the tip a little more visible, because when we start putting this together, it can be kind of difficult to see where a triangle is pointing, and this just gives it a front or forward identifier. So I'm going to get the pencil tool, and I'm going to go down right about there and just fill that in. That way we'll be able to see our marker and where it's pointing a little easier. Let's get the origin point tool, and I want it on the tip of the marker where it's pointing. So that'll be an X of 24 and a Y of 12. Okay, and let's make sure that our collision polygon covers the entire box. Okay, let's exit out of that, and I'm going to rename this marker. So we have our player, our loot object, and our markers. We are going to be creating the loot and the marker in-game. So we're not going to start out with any. So I'm just going to select both of those and hit delete. And it tells us we've deleted the last instance. It's still in the project. We just don't have any in our layout. All right, let's go over to the event sheet. And I'm going to right-click and add a new group. And I'm going to call this loot creation. And then I will add an event to loot creation. And I want a way to just test this out. So I'm going to set it up to where when I press the space bar, it's going to create loot randomly. And then we'll be able to test out if our marker works on finding where the loot is off screen. And if we want to add more loot objects, we can just keep pressing the space bar. So I'm going to go into our keyboard object and on key press. And I'll click to choose the space bar. Hit OK. We're done with that. And then we can add an action to this, and let's go into System and Create Object. And that object is, we can click to choose, let's choose Loot, hit OK. The layer is going to be this markers layer, so in quotation marks, let's type in markers, and the X from left to right on the screen is going to be randomly between the left edge of our layout and the right edge of our layout. That 5,000 by 5,000 that we set our layout to be. So X is going to use the expression of random, and random takes in properties, so we can put a parentheses, and I'm going to start at the far left of the layout, which is going to be 0, comma, and then I want to go, we could just say 5,000, but if we wanted to change the width of the layout at any time, then we'd have to change this. So I'm just going to use the built-in value of the width of the layout, and we can just type in layout width. So from 0 to the width of the layout, which is going to be that 5,000, and then in parentheses. And then for the y, we'll do the same thing. This is going to be random parentheses 0, comma, layout height, end parentheses. So this will create this loot object somewhere in our layout. Okay, hit done. And what I mean by that is this entire area that we set this checkered background on, it's going to randomly place it somewhere here. Okay, once the loot is created, we're going to want that marker to tell us where it is if it's off screen. So we're going to need a marker created at the same time that loot item is created. So let's go back to the event sheet and let's add an event to loot creation, and let's go into the loot object. So once we've created it up here, then I want to find out when it has been created. So I'm going to type in create and on created. So once it has been created, then we can add an action and we can go back into our loot object, and I'm going to type in spawn another object, and that object will be the marker, and the layer will be the markers layer, and the image point's going to be 0. And what this will do is whenever this loot piece is created, it's going to create a marker right on top of it. So once our marker is created, we also want to make sure that it is always pointing towards the loot object. So we can go ahead and set that up now. And I'm going to add an event to loot creation. I'm going to go into system and every tick. So every frame of the game, the angle of the marker object will be updated. So let's add an action, go into marker, and I'm going to use set angle toward position. So hit next, and that position that we want it to be set towards is going to be the loot object. So we can just type in the name of the object, which is loot, and .x for the x value, and then loot.y for the y value. Okay, let's go ahead and close up our loot creation group and right click. Let's add another group, and I'm just going to call this one loot position. So like I said, we're going to create some variables that will help us define where each piece of loot is located in the game. So I'm going to go over to the project panel, click on the loot object, then come over to instance variables, and let's add a new instance variable. So we're going to check for the x-axis and the y-axis, which will give us the exact location of the loot object. So I'm going to shorten position with POS and a capital X, and we're going to make that a string, and we can exit out of that and then add one more. Let's call this one POSY. Make sure that one is also a string. Okay. And I'll click on the loot object again. You can see our instance variables, position X and position Y. Okay, let's start checking each side of the viewport. So let's add an event to loot position, and let's go into the loot object, and I'm going to type in X and compare X. And I want to know if the X value of the loot object is less than the player's X value. So the X coordinate is going to be the player object dot X. Okay, we're going to come back to this in just a second. Okay, so what we're checking for right now is if this loot object is to the left of our player object. So if the loot object was right here, that statement would be true, but it's not what we want because we want to know if it's in this viewport area or off to the side where we can't see it. So we're going to have to add another check that checks for anything between this orange line and this red line. And then we'll do the same thing on the other side. We'll check to see if anything's between the orange line and this red line. So this is going to be an area to check for. This is going to be an area to check for. Same thing over here. This is its own area, and this is its own area. So we need to figure out how to calculate to know, one, is it to the left of the player, but within a certain area or beyond that certain area. So once we know if the loot object is to the left of the player, then we can check further. So let's highlight this whole block and press B on the keyboard to get a sub event. And then we're going to do another X value check. So let's double click on this new event, go into loot. Let's type in x, compare x, and we're going to start with is the loot object less than the player's x value, and then we want to subtract this distance from that equation. So let's go ahead and say minus, and then let's put this next equation in some parentheses. So start parentheses. I want to tell construct 3 to calculate half of that viewport size. So we can just type in viewport width, and then I want to divide that by 2. So it gives us half of the viewport. And then in parentheses, and then we need to tell construct 3 which viewport we're talking about. And that's going to be which layer we want it to calculate. So in another set of parentheses, start a parentheses and a quotation mark. Let's type in markers because that's the name of our other layer. And then end quote and end parentheses. And then we only want to calculate half of the viewport. So let's divide that by 2 and end parentheses. Okay? So what we're saying is the loot object to the left of the player object minus half of the viewport width? And we say minus because we're going to the left. And going to the left on the x value, the value decreases. Going to the right, the x value increases. So right now, our loot object over here is to the left of our player object, and it's also to the left of our player object in addition to the length of half of the viewport. So this would be true in this case. So that last piece of code is checking to see if we are to the left of this red line on the far left of our viewport. If our loot object is here, we are no longer to the left of this line, but we're still to the left of the player. And this is a separate check. So let's set that up as well. I'm going to highlight this whole block of code again, press B to get another sub-event under our other one, and I am going to double click to add another condition, get our loot object. I'm going to type in x, compare x, and this time instead of less than, let's check if it's greater than, and we can plug in the same information here. We want to know if it is greater than the player's x value minus the width of the viewport, or half of the width of the viewport. So let's plug that in. Let's start with a parentheses, type in viewport width, and we need to tell it what viewport we're talking about. So parentheses and a quote, and type in markers, end quote, in parentheses, and then this one will also be divided by 2, and end parentheses. So what we're looking at is the equation of the player's x subtracting half of the viewport, which would put that point right here, right on the very edge of the viewport, edge of the screen, because our player will always be in the middle of the viewport. Our camera follows our player and always has our player placed in the very center of the screen. So player's x minus half the viewport would be right here on the edge, and our loot is to the right of that edge, so it is greater than that equation. Okay, this is where our variables come into play. So up here in our first one, we set that up to be loot object is off screen to the left. So I'm going to add an action, go into loot, and scroll down to our set value and the POS X. So we're checking left and right. So that's our X axis. And in between quotation marks, we'll just call this left because it is to the left. Now, the other check we did was in this area. It's still to the left, but it's now within the viewport area. So I'm going to call that viewport. So if we add an action, go into loot, scroll down, let's get set value again, and our position X variable in between quotation marks, let's just type in viewport. And now we can set up the rest of our checks now that we know what we're looking for. So what I'm going to do is to check for the other side using this same method. So I'm going to click up here to highlight the entire block, Control C to copy, Control V to paste. And now we can just work on this block. Up here we check to see if the loot was to the left of the player. Now we can check to see if it is to the right of the player. So instead of loot less than player X, we can change less than to greater than. And then our sub-event checks, we can just reverse these as well. So let's double click to go into it. And instead of our player's X value minus half of the viewport width, we will add. So change that minus to a plus, and then come down here to this one, and we will do the same thing. Change the minus to a plus. Now we can set up the checks in our sub-events. And we're basically just reversing everything that we did up here because we're going to the other side, which is the plus side of the x-axis instead of the negative side. So let's double click to go into this first sub-event. So the equation here says less than the player x. Well, that's to the left. So we know that a higher x value would be greater than the player x. But now we want to go ahead and add that viewport width as well. So we'll change that minus to a plus. We can hit done, come down to the second one. We're going to do the same thing. We're just going to reverse those two things. Instead of greater than, we want to know if it is less than the player's x plus half of the viewport's width. Okay, so this one is checking to see if the loot is to the right of the player plus half of the viewport's width. So over here, that would be true. This would be to the right. So we can go into this action and change our left to say right. And this is doing the same thing that this is doing up here. It's saying it's still to the right of the player, but it's not beyond that far right edge red line. So the loot object would be somewhere in this area. So this will still be viewport. Okay. Let's set up a very similar check for the Y value. So I'm going to add an event to loot position, go into the loot object, and this time I'm going to type in a Y, and we'll have to scroll down to compare Y, and we will start with is it less than, which will make it above our player's Y position, and we'll just plug that in down here. So the player dot Y, because on the Y-axis, we decrease in value when we move up the screen and increase in value when we move down the screen. So if the Y value of the loot object is less than the player's Y value, then it'll be above the player. We're going to do the same thing we did up here. Let's highlight this whole block here, press B to get a sub-event, and then we'll go into that sub-event, get our loot object, and I'm going to press Y, scroll down, and get compare Y again. So let's go ahead and set it up like we did for the X value. Let's see if our loot object's Y position is less than the player.Y. And then we'll do the same thing like we did up there. We'll subtract half of the viewport's height minus, let's start a parentheses and type in viewport height. And then we have to tell it which viewport we're talking about. So start another parentheses, a quote, markers, end quote, in parentheses, and then let's make sure that we divide that by 2 to get half of the viewport and hit enter. Then we can highlight this whole block, press B again to get another sub-event below that, and let's do the same thing. Double click to go into it, get our loot, get our Y comparison, and this time we'll check to see if it's greater than the player's Y value minus the top half of the viewport. So let's type in viewport height, start another parentheses, quotation, markers, end quote, end parentheses, and let's divide that by 2, end parentheses. All right. Again, we're going to mimic what we do up here. So let's highlight this whole block that we just created. Control C to copy, Control V to paste. Let's scroll down. And instead of checking if it is above the player, let's double click to go in that, change that to greater than. So now we're checking if it is below the player. And like we did with the x-axis, we can double click into this and change less than to greater than, and make sure that we change that minus to a plus. Come down here, same thing, let's reverse it, greater than to less than, and that minus to a plus. Okay, let's go back up here to our first sub-event check under our Y check and add an action. And let's go into loot and scroll down to set value. And this time we're going to get position Y. And in between quotations, let's type in above, because that is our above check. And then this one is checking to see if we are still above the player, but within the viewport area. So that's going to be our viewport variable. So let's add an action to that. Get our loot, scroll down to set value, and get position Y. And let's type in viewport. So here's our below check when it's below the player. So this one is going to be below. So let's add an action, get our loot, set the value of position Y, in between quotes, type in below. And then down here, the same thing as this one. Let's add an action, go to loot, set the value of position Y, in between quotes, to viewport. If you have not saved in a while, let's go ahead and make sure you hit that save button. And the good news is that is all this takes to set this up. We will add something to all of these, but it'll be very easy and make a lot of sense when we get to it. But for now, I'm going to close up that group, and I'm going to right click and add another group, and I'm going to call this marker placement. This code will determine where the marker is located on screen. So every time a loot object is created, a marker is created and will be positioned to the appropriate place to point towards our loot item. Okay, let's start by adding an event to marker placement. And let's go get our loot object, and we're going to check for each one of those variables. So let's scroll down to compare instance variable. And let's start with the X. So position X is equal to, and then in quotation marks, we can check for left first. Okay, with this highlighted like that, let's press B to create a sub-event underneath that. And we're going to just go ahead and add an action to this without a condition in it. We'll come back to that in a minute. And we're going to set the X value of our marker object. So let's select the marker object. I'm going to type in set X. And we're going to use a very familiar equation here. We're going to set the X value of the marker to the player's X value, so player.x, but we want it to be on the edge of the screen. So if we know our player is always in the center of the screen, then it's going to be half of the screen's width to be on the edge of the screen. So we're going to do what we did with our loot position. We're going to do the same equation for our marker position. So let's subtract for the X value to the left. Let's subtract half of the viewport width from our player's X value. So player X minus, and then in parentheses, let's go viewport width, and the viewport in parentheses, in quotation marks, markers, end quote, end parentheses, and then we'll divide that by 2, end parentheses. What this is doing is it's taking our marker and it's placing it right where our player is. And then it's subtracting half of the viewport's width, so it will always be on the left side of our viewport, left side of the screen, right there at the edge at all times, while position X equals left. Okay, let's highlight this whole block, Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, and let's go into this variable and change left to right. So this is going to be on the right edge of the screen. So instead of a minus, we'll just add half of the viewport width. And then we can highlight this, Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste. And let's go into the variable and change right to viewport. And we can go into this action, and we won't need any of this because we're just going to set the marker to the loot's position. So type in loot.x. So when the loot object is on screen and we can see it, the marker will stay at that position right in the center of the loot object. But later on, we're going to make it be invisible when this occurs, and then become visible again if the loot object is no longer appearing on screen. Okay, I am going to highlight each one of these, make sure they're all highlighted, Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste. And let's start up here and change our position X to position Y. And this is going to be the above check. So let's change that left to above. And then we can come down here, change it to Y, change that to below. And the last one is going to be position Y, and it's going to stay viewport. Okay, let's go to position Y above, and let's go change some things in this action. So now we no longer want to know what the player's X value is, we want to know the Y value. And instead of viewport width, we're checking for viewport height. Everything else will stay the same there. And we have the minus because we're checking for above the player. Okay, and down here in this one, let's click to go in it, and let's make sure we change player X to Y, viewport width to viewport height, and we're checking for below, so that plus stays there. And in the last one, we will click to go in it, and we'll actually have to go back. So hit the back button here and go to set Y, and then we can change loot X to loot Y. Let's go ahead and save again. And I already noticed something that I forgot to do. We changed the set X to set Y in this one, but we didn't do it to these two when we changed the action. So let's go back up to position Y above, double click to go into that action, and let's hit the back button and change set X to set Y. And all that should still be there. So hit done. And let's go into this one, position Y below, change that action. Let's go back and set Y and hit done. Okay, we should be able to test this out. Let's hit play, and I'm going to hit spacebar to create a loot object, and there is the marker right up there. It is pointing towards it. You can see it change angles, and if I go up, it starts pointing to the left, and I'm having some scaling issues. Let's exit out. If yours looks like that, we can change something real quick. Let's go over to the layout, click on the layout to get the layout properties, and let's go down to project properties. And down here under display where it says full screen mode, mine for some reason is set to letterbox integer, and I just want letterbox scale. Okay, let's try that again. Let's play. There we go, taking up the whole screen now. Okay, I'm going to hit space, and it creates a loot over here this time. And you see it moves with us at the edge of the screen. And we can move all around it. And then when it's on screen, it's attached to the middle of that loot object. But we'll take care of that in a little bit. And then when we go off screen, it is back to the edge of the screen. So we know that that's working pretty well. If I hit space, let's say a few more times, now I have a problem. I have other loot objects, but my markers have absolutely no idea what to do. So we're going to have to find a way to identify each loot object and the marker that was created with it. And we will assign the marker to that specific loot piece. So if we have 20 loot objects on the layout, there will be 20 markers, and they will all point to the correct loot object. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to take the marker's instance ID that Construct 3 gives it, and we're going to assign that ID to the loot object in a variable. So let's click on the loot object in the project panel. Let's come over to properties, instance variable, and let's add a new instance variable. And I'm going to call this loot ID, and it will be a number. Hit OK, and we can exit out of that. Okay, let's go back up. I'm going to close marker placement for just a minute, and let's open up loot creation. And we have this onCreated event already here. So once the loot object is created, we also spawn a marker object with it. And in this same event, we can assign everybody their ID number and match them up later on. So let's add an action to this, and let's go into our loot object, scroll down, and we want to get that value of that instance variable. So set value, and loot ID number is the value we're going to set, and we're going to set it to, like I said before, the instance ID of the marker object. So that is built into Construct 3, and I will just type in the name of the object, which is marker, and then marker dot, and it's UID, which is unique ID. So it should look like that. We can hit done, and then I'm going to run this in debug layout, and I will hit space to create a loot object. So now we have a loot object right here, and if I select it, it shows us its X and Y value where it is in the layout, but it also has that loot ID instance variable, and it gave it the number 7. So if we go over here to our marker, click on it, over here we have the UID is 7. Let's try it again. I'm going to hit spacebar a couple more times, and we have a couple more markers and loot items. So if I click on one of these, you see UID 9. So I did marker number 1. Let's go to loot number 1, instance variable loot ID 9. Do the same thing with 0 here. Oh, that's the one we already did. Let's go to 2. UID is 11. Our loot object instance variable is 11. As soon as we are creating the loot object, we're giving that variable the same exact ID as the marker's default given unique ID. Okay, when we tested this earlier, the markers were freaking out and they were angling every which way depending on where I moved at the time, and it's not going to work. We need to identify the loot object first and then tell it to angle towards that. So I'm going to click on this every tick condition, press B to create a sub event, and then I'm going to click and drag this event, this every tick event, down here so that it is now in the sub event. We can do the same thing with the action. Click it and drag it down into the sub event. So for the actual event that takes place first, before we start angling the marker object, we can check to see which loot object we are talking about. So let's double click to go into this event and go into our loot object. Let's go down to our instance variables, and I want to compare instance variable. And I want to know if loot ID is equal to the marker.uid. All right. So now every frame of the game, 60 times every second, construct 3 is going to check to see which loot object and marker UID match. And then it's going to angle the marker object towards that loot object. Okay, let's go into our marker placement group. And I put all these in sub events because I want to check the loot object's variable first and then set the position of the marker. But if we have, say, 10 loot items on screen or in the game, and 5 of them are on the left side of the player, they're all going to be assigned left for the value of position X. So we want to do what we did up here and identify which object we're speaking of. And here we decided to check for the loot object matching the marker's UID. Down here, since we are telling the marker where to be located, we can pick that object specifically. So let's double click into the condition area and let's go into our marker object. And I'm going to type in pick, and I want pick by unique ID. Then we can just tell it to pick the unique ID number that matches the loot object number. So let's type in loot.lootID. That's the instance variable for the loot object. If our loot object is on the left side of the screen, then that particular object, or all loot objects that have left as the value of position X, are going to go find which marker has their same ID number. And when it finds a match, it's going to set the position of the marker every frame of the game. So this right here is going to go in all of these. So let's highlight this, Control-C to copy, and then we can just click on this condition down here to highlight it, Control-V to paste. Do the same thing with each one of these blank conditions. Okay, let's test this real quick. There's one. It works good. I'm going to create a few more. And they're not popping up right away. So what we're going to have to do is make sure that we are accounting for every object that is created. So even though this code is directing construct 3 where to look, it's not checking all the pieces of loot that are on screen or that have been created. So what I'm going to do is on this very top condition in our marker placement group, I'm going to right click right over here on the edge. Let's right click and I'm going to go to add and insert above. And if we go into system, we can check every piece of loot that is on screen every frame of the game. So this entire code that we just set up will run every frame of the game. So I'm going to type in 4, and we want 4 each. So this is going to loop through every loot object that has been created. So let's click to choose our loot object, hit done. And if we click on this first position X check, and then we can scroll down to the bottom, hold shift and click on the last one, and that will highlight all of that. And we're going to grab this little area right here, click and drag up until you see that line. Go to the right until you see that line indent. You see how it's flush with the left edge, and we move to the right, it indents, and let go. And now everything that we created is now a sub-event of our for each loop. Okay, let's test that out. I'll create 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so now everywhere I go, our markers are on screen at the edge of the screen telling us where each loot object is. And we got a little bit of issue there. We'll fix that here in just a second. It's working pretty good. Okay, let's exit out of that. Okay, so let's fix that problem real quick. If we go over to the layout, what's happening is the camera is following the player until it gets to the edge, and then the camera stops and the player can still move. But if we click on the layout and bring up the layout properties, down here we have unbounded scrolling, and it is unchecked. So I'm going to check that, make sure it is checked. And now if we play and I create a bunch of loot pieces, we have some arrows going on, and now we are unbounded. The camera follows me no matter where I go, and our markers, as you can see on the right edge, they stay on the edge of the screen, and we don't have that problem anymore. Okay. Now we can get rid of the marker's visibility when the loot is on screen, because that just looks kind of funny. Before we do that, let's make sure we are saving and head back on over to the event sheet. And up here in loot creation, we are going to check for each marker, just like we did for each loot piece. So we can add an event to loot creation, and let's go into system, and let's type in for each and get for each, and let's click to choose the marker. So anything we do underneath this indented as a sub event is going to take place every time Construct 3 loops through all the markers on screen or in the game, which in our case, I guess the markers would always be on screen. So with this whole line of code highlighted, press B to get a sub event. And I'm just going to use an overlap check. So let's double click to go into this event and go into marker. And I'm going to type in overlapping another object. And I will click to choose the loot object. Hit done. So as this is right now, if one marker is overlapping a loot object, any other markers on screen would be set to invisible if we were to just add an action and set invisible. So just like we did down here, we need to check and make sure that our loot object and our marker both have matching IDs. So let's highlight this sub event and press B to make a sub event under it. And then we can double click to go in and go to our loot object and scroll down to the instance variables, and let's compare the loot ID is equal to the marker.uid. Okay, now we can go and add an action to that event and go into our marker and set our visibility. So set visible to invisible. Okay, so that is if the marker is overlapping the loot object. If it's not overlapping the loot object, then we want to set it back to visible. So let's click and highlight this sub event and the sub event under it and hit X on your keyboard. That will give you an else statement. And notice that it is indented under our loop here. And then we can go in to the else statement, add an action, go to marker and type in visible, set visible to visible. Okay, let's save. Remember to save as often as you can. And then let's play and test this out. I'll hit space a few times. And if you notice, we have 2 that randomly spawned on screen and there's no markers. But as soon as we move off screen, their markers appear. And here's a good example here. There's a marker right there, and when we go on screen, it disappears and then comes back when it goes off screen. So we have accomplished the issue of visibility. Now let's make our loot objects collectible. So here in our loot creation group, I'm going to add another event to loot creation. And let's go to our player object. And I'm going to type in collision on collision with another object. And click to choose the loot object. So on collision, that will mean that we have collected it. We can destroy it. The problem with that is, just like up here, if we collect one loot object and there's 10 in the game, as soon as we collide with one, they'll all be destroyed. So let's highlight this whole block and press B for a sub event. And let's go into this condition and let's go into the marker, and I'm going to type in pick instance. So pick by unique ID. And that unique ID is going to be the value of the loot objects variable. So loot.loot ID. So now it knows which object to pick. And once it picks it, we can add an action, go into loot and type in destroy. And then we want to make sure that the marker goes with it. So let's add an action, go into marker, destroy, and that should take care of both of those. And it should pick the right one to destroy. We can play. I'll hit space a few times. There is our marker. I'll do this blue one right here. It has a marker. If I collect it, it disappears. And if I move off screen, the marker is no longer there. So that looks like we have made it collectible and we are destroying the correct objects. Okay. All right. That is the mechanic as I have it set up. One more thing I want to do, I want to show you. If I press space a few times, you notice these markers are at the edge of the screen, at the very edge. I don't necessarily like that visually. That may work for your project, and that's fine. But I'm going to make these not be on the edge like that. I'm going to make them come back just a few pixels so it's a little clearer to see them. All right, I'm going to exit out and I'm going to set up a value, but we're going to have to use it in several places. So I'm just going to create another variable and we'll use that variable throughout our code. So let's scroll up to the top, and if you press V on the keyboard, it will add a global variable, and I'm going to call this one padding. Keep it a number. I'm going to give a value of 15. You'll be able to see what this does here in a minute, and you can go in and change this at any time. And it put it at the very bottom. I'm just going to click and drag mine all the way to the very top. And I'm going to close up loot creation for right now. Let's go down to marker placement. So whenever we place the marker in this position, if we go into the action where we set the actual position, we have set the marker to players X minus half of the viewport. So I'm going to add that padding to the end of this. So since we have player X minus half of the viewport width, I'm going to go back the other direction, that 15 pixels. So at the very end, I'm going to say plus, and then just type in padding. And to make it easier, I'm going to highlight that padding word and Control C to copy. This will just make it easier here in just a minute. Let's go down to the next one. And here we're adding half of the viewport width to the player X. So we want to come back the other direction and subtract our padding, and I'm just going to say Control V to paste our padding variable, and then come down here for our y-axis checks and go into this one, and we have minus the viewport width, so I'm going to add the padding, and then in this one we added the viewport width, so I will subtract the padding. Okay, and if we play that, I think we might still have an issue here. So you can see that it comes up off the edge, and it's a little easier to see the markers. And nope, I think that's good. Yeah. I think it's good. In my original project when I made this mechanic. I went into loot position and I changed all these to do what we did in our marker position. So if it was minus the viewport width, we would add the padding. I don't necessarily think you need that here, but if you run into an issue and you think that 15 pixels might be the answer, then go in to each one of these and add or subtract the padding to each one of these depending on what you do here. So if you subtract half the viewport height from the player Y, you'll want to add the padding to go in the opposite direction. So if you need that, that is an option there. So let's go ahead and save again. And I'm going to play, and let's check this out one last time. I'm going to just create a bunch of them. There we go. We got markers for days, and they're all doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They're all 15 pixels from the edge of the screen. And I just chose 15 to show you that they can come off the edge of the screen. It's noticeable, more noticeable that way. So go ahead and play with some of these values. One more thing I will mention is that a lot of this is repeated code with some variances, small variances. Ideally, you would create a function that would have all these possibilities, and you would be able to punch in just a few different values, and you would get rid of a lot of this code and just repeat the function, which is just one piece of code. I am not going to go through that in this video. I just wanted to make sure that we get the idea of how this works, how to place the markers, and make sure that we are always checking for the matching IDs and that Construct 3 knows which ones to create and to match up and to destroy. That is going to do it for this video. If you are not subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and hit that sub button. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up as well. I always appreciate your support. I am off to go record the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next one.